A while back, I hosted a SciShow video about the physics of knitted fabric, and it got me in some trouble. We got a couple of factual things wrong in the video, which is never ideal, but the part that really upset people was not the mistakes, it was the tone of the video. In defense of the SciShow team, I think the intended vibe really was like, here's this everyday thing that looks super simple, but when physicists zoom in on it, it becomes astonishingly complex. But in doing that, the story that came across here was like, people who knit don't really understand what they're doing, and now the scientists are here to explain it. And yeah, that's bad, especially because that reflects a very long history of treating the work of textiles, which is like deeply skilled labor, a lot of innovation, as invisible or trivial, or just like something people do with their hands, rather than what it is, which is like a foundational technology of civilization. And this is, of course, bad just on its own merit. But it's also bad because it shuts down curiosity and openness and excitement and marvel, which is the opposite of SciShow's goals, and also the opposite of my disposition. SciShow has internal systems for responding to critique. I will link to their statement in the description, but the words came out of my mouth. I'm not proud of how they represented that history. And I also got a lot of thoughtful feedback. And look, with any time this is happening, I totally understand this is a thing with every creator I know. It's very hard to understand which parts of the feedback you want to listen to and not feel defensive all the time. So it took me some time, but I got a lot of thoughtful feedback. Several people told me, dude, you need to read this book. And several books were recommended to me, but the one I saw the most was called The Fabric of Civilization. So I got it and I read it. And look, sometimes people suggest to me books that are fine, and I'm glad that I read them. This book is so good. It is wild. It's a pretty fast read. It has completely reframed how I understand textiles, but also like technology. Like after spending some time with this, textiles to me, I think sit like right alongside agriculture and also like happened along with agriculture. Like we think about meat animals and we think about food crops, but we also had textile animals and textile crops. So yeah, I think textiles sit alongside agriculture as like the second or third most powerful human technology after language. And this should not be a surprise or a mystery. Technology and textiles share the same linguistic root. Like we live in a world built out of textiles, but we barely see them, which is why I was able to sort of badly misread the emotional territory of the SciShow script. And it's also why Postural's book hit me so hard. So I reached out to her. And I was like, would you like to have a chat with me about your book? But first, I let her know about the whole situation so she wasn't wading into some weird situation blindly. She graciously had zero qualms about the whole thing. And now I'm in the room with Virginia Posturel, who is the author of The Fabric of Civilization. First of all, thank you for doing this. Thank you for writing this book. It's so fun. It's like perfect for me. It's got everything. But first, can you tell people a little bit about who you are?
I am a writer. I've been a writer professionally for more than 40 years. A lot of my writing is around the intersection of commerce, culture, and technology. So I'm interested.
Well, that's all the things, Virginia.
Yeah, that is all the things. And this book is in some ways, like the most Virginia book ever, because it's got history, it's got economics, it's got technology and science and culture and ingenuity and all of those kinds of things.
War and peace and
right.
the progress of humanity. So I want to hit you with two quotes from your book. One is from someone that you interviewed, referring to fabric as taking up the most valuable real estate in the world, the surface of our bodies. I was like, yeah, sure, I guess. I'd never thought of it that way. How true, both functionally and, as we will get into, beyond just function. But then I think also a quote from you, any sufficiently familiar technology is indistinguishable from nature. So taking the Arthur C. Clarke quote and turning it on its head.
Right.
So good. And it's amazing how fast this can happen.
Yeah.
But with textiles, it's particularly amazing because they were such a foundational technology and seen as so vital at every point in human history. Now they're gone.
The complete forgetting is actually taking place in my lifetime. I was born in 1960.
Yeah.
So when I was a kid, textiles were still, there were still miracle fibers and, your mom remembered when there wasn't permanent press and there was still a fairly large textile industry in the US. as well as a lot of plants making things like nylon. And I mean, when I was born, my dad actually worked in a rayon as an engineer for a rayon company.
Yeah.
So this has really happened recently, that the complete not thinking about where textiles come from, but it's also something that is woven through history.
One of the big things here is how invisible it is. And also the sort of like what that invisibility is hiding. How much of that is that like history is kind of dominated by and written by men, and a lot of this stuff is the work of women, or also the demand of women, like that, like consumption is such an important part of this.
Well, it's certainly the case that the entrance of lots of women into the history profession and the existence of writing about women's lives as a field of research has made it easier to research the history of textiles on some of these things. And if you go to a conference of textile archaeologists, it will be 90% women, which is interesting. I mean, everybody knows the few men who are in that field. On the other hand, textiles as economic history, there it's less gendered because it's been so central in economic history as, as trade goods, as a source of industrial innovation, that sort of thing. So I think part of it is that, but the other thing is that the textile industries, and you have to different. A lot of people, when you say textiles, they think of apparel. And when you're talking about the industry, it's really different because textiles is a capital intensive industry and apparel is a labor intensive industry. But both have largely left the developed world. And so you will be much more likely to find, people in India or people in China who are thinking about textile technology. There's like 2 really good schools left in the US that study textiles.
There are components of it that are heavily gendered, and and also probably culturally, this is very different. So like in European tradition, weaving in addition to spinning would also be often done by no.
No. In European tradition, women were actually prohibited most of the time from joining the weaving guilds. So weaving was a male occupation, and the women who wove were usually the wives or daughters of weavers. Whereas in China, there is a saying, men till women weave. And in India, it was primarily a men's occupation. I mean, spinning is the universally
so interesting. Yeah.
Female.
So why do you think it is such a hidden part of our story?
Well, I think it's partly, I have a line in the book where I say we have textile amnesia because we enjoy textile abundance. I really think fundamentally that's the reason we don't think about it. If you go back, I have this book, I think it's from the 1940s or something. It's like I don't know, it reads like it was written as a textbook for, junior high school or something. It's called Man as a Weaver. And it's all about textiles. And it was much more normal to teach about textiles up until the, say, 1960s than it was than it is today. As it's just a thing you need to know. And one of the things that I was shocked when I started working on the book was how little the typical person, like the typical middle-aged person, knows about textiles. Like that weaving and that woven and knitted cloth are different. Like I grew up in a textile town in the 1960s and 70s, and everybody knew that.
I mean, I did know that, but there is so much that I feel like is very basic that I did not know.
Or that there's warp and weft.
I still have a hard time with warp and weft. They made those 2 words too similar to each other.
Okay, so here's how you remember it.
Okay.
Weft goes from weft to right.
Oh, thank you. Perfect. I'm done. I did it. You did it.
And the other not quite as good mnemonic is that warp sounds sort of like hard, and the warp thread is the thread that's
the tense
called
one.
and it needs to be tougher.
Right. So I'll try to put some a graphic on the screen to help people understand what we're talking about right now. We're talking about looms. The introduction to your book is so great because you don't even call to the fact that you're using all of these metaphors. You're not like, here's a list of like textile based metaphors that we use constantly, like threadbare.
Yeah. My favorite being on tenterhooks.
Yeah, what the heck is a tenterhook?
When people would finish wool, so you'd make the cloth, and then there was a process called fulling where it would get wet and then it would be pounded on. Sometimes people walked on it. Sometimes later on there were water-driven machines. And so the wool would kind of shrink and then you'd stretch it on these really scary looking pointy hooks around the edge. Not hooks, really points.
My favorite textile word is that we go to space on a shuttle.
Yes, exactly.
One of the things that I'm, in terms of the most important human technologies, I think it's sort of undeniable that language is number one. I think that it is generally considered that like on the path to where we are today, agriculture is number two. I think that it gets pretty messy after that. When I think like in terms of sort of like step by step, fiber, cordage, textiles all happened before agriculture. They also played an important part in agriculture. We think about, the food agriculture all the time, but we don't think about that there are fiber animals and there's fiber crops that are very important and were part of the introduction of agriculture. But also like before anatomically modern humans, there was cordage. There was like figuring out how to turn fiber into thread or rope or whatever to do things with. And so that to me is like, well, this is pre-agricultural and also maybe like a necessary step to get to agriculture.
Right. So the earliest string that's been found, and it's clearly string. I mean, you do have to look, it does need to be magnified, but it is not some random vine. It's been twisted and then plied, which means you take two twisted strings and twist them together in the opposite direction.
Gotcha.
It's 50,000 years old, and it was made by Neanderthal.
Yeah.
And the article about it was actually published between the time I submitted the first manuscript and the time I did the revision. So when I first wrote the book, the earliest string was 30,000 years old. Now it's 50,000. So there's an argument, which I don't make in the book because I don't think it's a hypothesis, but I think it's that I believe, but I don't. Which is that it's actually textiles that make agriculture necessary. So string, you don't need agriculture to make string. You just need some wild source of fiber that you can rub between your hands or rub on your legs and make cordage from, and then you can, twist those together if you need string. And it's a huge general purpose technology because once you have string, you can make, fishing nets, you can make baby carriers, you can tie things up above the ground.
And I think, Virginia, that we were doing this so much. Like this is what the majority of human time has been spent doing. Yeah. We were sitting around with each other, talking and making strings and weaving, and whether it's on like a loom or whether it's just like sitting around like making string into rope.
Yeah. So that's string. But as we mentioned peripherally, to make textiles, to actually make cloth, you need a huge amount of string.
And you need like good string that's like the right.
You need it to be strong and long. There's about 6 miles of cotton yarn or string in a pair of blue jeans.
Yeah.
So that's 6 miles. And before the Industrial Revolution, the fastest and best spinners in the world who were in India, especially for cotton, one of them would take like 100 hours to spin enough for, a pair of trousers. That takes a lot of cotton to make. I mean, like you basically you need agriculture in order to make textiles, and you need textiles in order to make clothes in a non-freezing climate. And there is an argument. There's a guy named Ian Gilligan who's in Australia who makes the argument that essentially textiles were invented as the Ice Age receded because over all the time of the Ice Age, people had gotten used to wearing clothes made of fur and leather and, animal skins and tailored to the body. Yeah. And that basically the Adam and Eve story is kind of right, that modesty was the reason you can't keep on wearing those clothes when it's warm. Because
did we invent agriculture because we didn't want to be naked anymore?
Something like that. There are people who don't agree with that, but point is, you can eat by hunting and gathering. You can't make textiles by hunting and gathering because you can't get enough. That's the simplified version. That's my hypothesis, which is that agriculture is driven at least maybe in a majority part by
and certainly a lot more than we think.
Yeah, a lot more than we think.
This is a question I try to always ask communicators when they're talking about the things they communicate about. So I am fascinated by what makes a good fact. In order to be a good fact, it has to actually, people have to care about it for some reason. So it might be relevant to their lives. It might be surprising or counterintuitive, but then it also needs to like do the work. So like, it needs to bring a lot of understanding along with it. So I'm curious if you could pick anything out of your book that is like the best fact.
There are a bunch of them around indigo, and indigo is the blue that we now know best from blue jeans. Indigo is a crazy, crazy complicated process to get it to work.
Yeah.
The chemistry is just unbelievable, but it was discovered all around the world in completely different and separated cultures using completely unrelated plants that happen to have the same chemicals in them. And the earliest indigo dyed cloth we have is 6,200 years old.
Wow.
And that, as I say in the book, 6,200 years ago, people were poor by any contemporary standard. And yet they went to a lot of trouble to make this cloth that has indigo stripes and also has two other colors. It has sort of tannish brown, which is the natural color of cotton, and it has a white, which is from a local plant.
Yeah.
That just shows that people care about more than function going way back, which is another.
They sure do. God, there's a couple of things I want to talk about there. First, in terms of chemistry, I'd love to do an episode about this actually, but like one of the kind of the first chemical, like obviously the first chemical was hydrogen, like diatomic hydrogen at the beginning of the universe.
In the creation of the universe.
Yeah, but like when you say chemical, there's like a thing that we mean. So like created synthetically and at scale. And kind of the first chemical is like mauvine.
We can have a long, interesting conversation about what is the first chemical, even as you define it. So there was this period in the mid 19th century where chemistry was, had been developed as a science and people were fooling around. And there was a lot of this waste product from things like refining, that would give people the wrong idea, but people would make gas for lamps in homes and street lights and stuff. And there was this waste product called coal tar.
Terrible
that was
stuff.
Produced by that.
Yeah.
And people think this could be a useful chemical source for things.
Sure.
And there's this young guy named William Perkin, who's 19-year-old chemistry student in London, studying under a German professor, because the Germans were all the great chemists in this era. And he's home on Easter vacation, and he is fooling around with coal tar and trying to make quinine, which is an anti-malarial drug. His experiments fail. He gets this black precipitate. He, for whatever reason, decides to dissolve it in denatured alcohol, and it turns purple. And so he thinks,
this is amazing news.
I'm living in a country where the major industry is textiles. Maybe this could be a dye. Maybe I could, start a company and make a lot of money. So he asks around and he hears, yes, in fact, purple's kind of having a fashion moment, and there isn't good purple dye for silk and cotton. Makes his discovery in 1856. Remarkably, within 4 years, mauve is everywhere. That's what he calls it, this purple dye. But he essentially has to not only invent this chemical, he sort of has to invent chemical engineering, because he has to scale up. He has to invent the processes and the apparatuses for all the apparatuses, whatever the plural.
Sure. Apparati.
For doing it at scale, which is quite a challenge. But he succeeds. And then once we have mauve, which is this purple dye, which he wanted to call Tyrian purple. Once people see this, then everybody starts making dyes. And there's green and there's blues and there's reds, and eventually there, is synthetic indigo. And that becomes the basis for the chemical industry. That's the beginning of the modern chemical industry. And that leads to a lot of chemists being hired. And then once you have all these chemists, what else can they come up with? And they do come up with a lot of drugs drugs and adhesives and photographic chemicals eventually and all of these things. But, so Bayer, for example, who invented aspirin, they started as a dye works.
And I want to tie back to your fact also that like indigo getting discovered separately in all these different cultures. The thing that I realized is that like not every civilization has like a Bronze Age,
right?
But they all have like textile ages. And one of the maybe the big reasons why we don't talk about it that way is just because they don't preserve archaeologically. Like bronze and steel and all this stuff is like stone tools. They're all like very long lasting in the ground. But like textiles, unless like in Peru, it's very dry, they go away.
Yeah, there are two ways that textiles can be preserved as textiles. One is in a very dry climate. So the oldest textiles have been found in Israel, and Peru is a great source of early textiles. The other thing is there are bogs in Europe where it's an anaerobic environment, and so there are textiles preserved there. But the result is there are places in the world that we have no textile archaeology from, or it's it's the earliest textiles we have are medieval, something like that, as opposed to really old. And even there are other ways that archaeologists trace textiles. Let's say you have something bronze that was wrapped in a textile and the textile goes away. You'll often get some kind of like oxidized imprint on it. But up until like the 1980s, it wasn't unusual for archaeologists to clean off these remnants of the textiles because they didn't even think about textiles.
So not just we didn't see them because they weren't there, but we didn't see them because we couldn't imagine their importance.
I mean, another example, and this was one of the facts that sort of inspired me to think there was a book, was so these linear B tablets in Knossos in Crete, which is one of the great archaeological sites. And there are all these tablets and the thousands of them, and the deciphering of them is a big story, which I won't tell, but it's one of the stories of archaeology and languages.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out 2/3 of these tablets are about textiles.
Yeah.
So I met this woman who started as a linguist and historian on these tablets, and then she realized she's got to learn about textiles. She, with two other people, started this Center for Textile Research at the University of Copenhagen.
Would it have been linen? Would it have been flax? What?
It depends on where you are.
Yeah.
There are different parts of the world that have characteristic fibers. And so in, say, the Middle East, you get a lot of linen. In Europe, you get linen eventually, but especially you get wool.
Yeah.
East Asia, you get hemp and silk. Silk is unbelievably old, which is amazing.
Silk is crazy. The fact that we have an agricultural bug. So first of all, I didn't even know that linen was from a different plant until I read this book. I'm coming from early stuff. But then silk, like all of these agricultural, like wool, these fibers are going to be, like at most a few feet long.
Right.
And then silk, how long is a silk thread? Strand.
These days, miles. It's a filament.
Like one filament that came out of the butt of one bug.
Yeah, right. So you get one cocoon. I mean, this is, I mean, in the 21st century, there's been a lot of hybridization.
Have we bred them? We've bred them too. Okay, yeah.
But it would be miles. It wouldn't have been as long, 1,000 years ago or whatever. Yeah. But it's a filament in the same way that, polyester is a filament. You then twist it, but it's not called a fiber in the same way that a little cotton, a little cotton fiber is, inches maybe. and I should say, when I was going around the world, cotton was the fiber in India, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and in Latin America, it was one of the major fibers. And there's a whole crazy story about
cotton is very weird.
why. Yeah, cotton is, there's lots of fun facts about cotton.
I have a favorite fact, and we're going to get to it eventually. But and have I asked any but two of my questions yet? No, because there's just too much to talk about. But we're hitting all of the things I want to hit. So there's just that's like a wild difference that I had never considered, and also the fact that you have to untangle a silk cocoon. You don't just like cut them up and make fibers out of it. You untangle this entire.
Yeah, it's sort of, there's like a sticky kind of gluey substance that holds it together, so that gets dissolved in warm water, and then you have to reel it very carefully.
Craziness. Okay, so I'm going to tell you my fact that I took, that I immediately shared with my wife, which is that it took significantly, like much more time, both in like years of like time it takes from start to finish, and in terms of human hours being spent on the project to make the sail for a Viking warship than to make the Viking warship. You know, the bottleneck was not timber and carpenters and woodworking. The bottleneck was sheep and wool and spinners.
Yeah, and so that's shearing or plucking the sheep. It's cleaning the wool. It's spinning the wool. It's weaving the wool, and then it's sewing the woven panels.
Yeah, because you can't make it the size that. Yeah.
So the if you see that, this is a Indian print behind me, but this is about how wide the panels that were woven on a traditional loom in the Viking era would have been. And the thing is, I will confess, I watched the entire series of the TV show Vikings, just like, I think six, maybe seven seasons. There's a long show, is the point.
And you're just like waiting, you're like, when they gonna get to the wool?
Well, no, I know this at the time I was watching the show, but it's in all of those episodes, there is one shot of a loom in the background. And so it's like, what did they do? Order the sails from IKEA? It's like,
it's invisible. Any sufficiently familiar technology is indistinguishable from nature.
Invisible in the sense that while there are Scandinavian textiles from bogs and stuff, we don't have any Viking sails. Think about the Industrial Revolution suddenly making, among other things, sails much more available.
Wow. Yeah.
But also in the great age of exploration that starts in the 1400s, those sails would have all been made entirely by hand and would have been very laborious to make.
And then all of the cordage too, like how much rope is on that boat.
Exactly, all the rope and cordage and all of that stuff. Yeah,
like it's like a veil has lifted. It's just like there's so much of the world that I did not, of history that I could not see because this thing is so invisible to us. There's a section on the book early on about spinning and about how sort of integral to life it was, because textiles are so important, not just for clothes, but also for exploring the world and
flour sacks. There were barrels too, but there were lots of things.
Like war, like you need to outfit the armies. So very important, like really integrated into society. Everybody's spinning. Like every woman is spinning.
All the women.
Yeah. And I had in my head a picture of like, okay, who's spinning yarn? It's old, poor women. And this is a totally inaccurate picture. I want to ask you a question. Do you think that picture was in my head because those were the last people spinning? And so that's sort of like the last image that we carried forward? Because as the craft left us.
So first of all, who was spinning? All women all the time.
Yeah. Noble women, young women were like spinning in public so that men would come and court them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Women would have these spinning bees at night, and then guys would come and hit on them. Greek prostitutes would spin between clients, and there are pictures. There's pictures in Western art. There's every kind of woman who could be spinning is spinning. The Virgin Mary is spinning. Prostitutes are spinning. Everyone in between is spinning. I think your hypothesis might be correct, because if you think about when the Industrial Revolution starts and you get spinning machines in the late 18th century in the north of Britain. Particularly young women go into those factories and work. But older, if you were an old lady like me, only in the 18th century, I would have been a lot older.
Your body would have been through more.
Right. You're not going to, I would have died multiple times, actually. We can talk about that in a different show. But you probably weren't retrained for this new job. And there still would be some market, the wage you would get or the price you would get for your spinning. It was usually
right. The factories would have driven the prices way down.
Would have been driven down. And in fact, there is this very sad, often quoted letter or something from an Indian widow. She was a widow and she didn't have any source of income. So she used to spin and she was able to marry off her daughters. She was able to get enough. But now the yarn comes in from Manchester and she can't make a living. But she has to admit that this yarn is at least as good as what she makes, And so it is quite possible that that's why you have the old lady spinning by the fire kind of image. But it really was everybody's, all the women, right? And we have these codices from the sort of pre-Columbian life in Mexico. And we know that Aztec women, they talk about what the boys are being taught to do and what the girls, and the girls start to learn to spin when they're 4. Not that they would be doing a very good job.
No.
4. The Industrial Revolution, which set off the whole great enrichment of the world, starts with spinning machines. And I think in a way, it could have started with something else. But the fact that it was spinning and particularly spinning cotton meant that it had big ripple effects through the rest of the economy and society.
So speaking of that, and speaking of this letter that this Indian woman wrote, we are now in a world where it is difficult to imagine a world where textiles are not abundant. So like you could totally go to Goodwill right now and you could see someone like in your town, you could do this right now and you could see a human person dropping off trash bags full of cloth at the Goodwill. That is happening in every town in America right now. Like an individual garment might have at one point been like the most expensive thing a person owned. So we did this transition from this being like the thing I'm wearing right now could have been the most expensive thing I own.
And you would be in danger of, like, when you hung it out to dry in your laundry.
Oh, for sure.
Stolen. So a lot of what we know about, how much garments cost is from the Old Bailey records of criminal.
Oh my God! You brought up the Old Bailey records. I have an Old Bailey story for you. So I did this. I'll get back to my point in a second, which is going to be about artificial intelligence. But first, let's talk about this. So I years ago I went back because there are these 7 people who were the first people to be experimented on with variolation. So like early vaccines. So with smallpox variolation, and they were 7 criminals in the Newgate jail, which is, if you go to the Old Bailey, which is the place in London, it's like it's like the criminal court in London. That's where the Newgate jail used to be. So there's these 7 people, and I like looked up their arrest records because you can do that. Yeah. And I was like, okay, these first 7 people to ever get the smallpox vaccine or variolation, slightly different thing, in Europe. And so I was like, okay, what did these people do? One of them was a pickpocket. One of them stole from her. She was like a housekeeper, and she stole from the person whose house she was keeping. The other ones all stole textiles. They all of them, they stole a riding hood or a bolt of cloth or some leather. This was before I was recording these kinds of conversations, but I got on the phone with like a historian of prisons, and I was like, why are they all like, what was this, like a weird outlier? And he was like, no, that was like the most transferable form of wealth. It was a lot. There was a lot of money in it, and it was easy to move from one place to another and then resell. So it was a very common theft item.
And you could also pawn. I mean, and people did. I mean, even George Orwell in Down and Out in Paris and London, he would pawn his coat periodically when he needed money. I mean, and that's like in the 20th century.
The thing I want to talk about is, so we found ways to make textiles super abundant and super cheap. And it is a story of going from scarcity to abundance in a really like concrete way that is now like, I feel like we're not noticing it because, I mean, I think that this is part of this conversation with the Luddites and the actual Luddites, the historical Luddites. First of all, can you speak a little bit, we've already done this some, but like to how central textile labor was in people's lives, like the labor itself in people's lives?
Well, a huge amount of the economy was people working in one way or another in textiles. It's the biggest industry in many countries for a long time. And when I say for a long time, I mean after the Industrial Revolution too.
Yeah.
It's because there are all these stages. So it's a big part of agriculture. There's the cleaning and processing. So, cotton gins, that's a separate business with people working in them. And then it's the spinning mills or the individual spinning. And then it's the weaving. And again, there's like a generation where there's mechanical spinning and the weavers are riding high and making a lot of money without having a scarcity of yarn, which had been the case before. And then comes mechanical looms, and that's when you get the Luddites. But the funny thing about the Luddites is they're the beneficiaries of an earlier wave of technology. Yeah. And they're not ideologues. They don't hate technology. It's not like we use the word today. Yeah. They're just guys who don't want to lose their jobs. Yeah. And many of them actually, a surprising number, go to work with power looms. Yeah. This is not something in the book. Yeah. It's something I've read about more recently. It's a huge percentage of any economy. It was the representation of industry in Western art was a woman spinning. And that was because production of cloth is a huge thing. And really up until probably the 1980s, I haven't looked it up, but textiles and apparel would account for a large percentage, much larger than today, of an American family's annual budget. Now it's basically nothing.
Depends on the household probably, but yeah.
Yeah.
So we've done, this transition is like a very solid part of our history. I think since we're headed into a moment where maybe like a lot of the labor currently done by humans right now might in 10 or 20 or 50 years, I don't know what the numbers are, but it might be done by like software and robots. That to me kind of seems like very current and unprecedented, but this is definitely precedent. Like the industrialization of textiles is it accessible, fairly recent precedent. I don't know if you feel at all positioned to talk about that, but I feel like you might actually be more well positioned than a lot of people who are spending a lot of time talking about it right now.
I mean, I do. I think about it from 2 points of view. First of all, this is not completely unprecedented in the sense that this textile transition to the Industrial Revolution basically was a huge upheaval in a fairly short period of time when society was much, much poorer. The other thing that I think a lot about, partly because I did learn to hand weave as a result of the book, and that's a thing I do as a hobby. I think that these kinds of physical making activities will enjoy a resurgence, not as economic activities necessarily, although you might have them for the luxury markets. But as, if you have more leisure, one thing you might do with that leisure is learn how to do woodworking or make cloth or that sort of thing. It is an upheaval. I mean, there's no question that when people have spent their lives learning how to do a particular thing well, and this goes to your question about the old lady spinner, if you're young, then you go to work in the spinning mill. If you're old, you just keep doing what you were doing and it's worth less. My personal view is the only way to deal with it is to go through it and to try to ease the difficulties as much as you can. And the fact that we are a very rich country and rich society, and we're not in the 18th century, should make it easier. But people who have been thinking themselves, superior human beings because of their technical chops, their ability to write code, for example, may end up like the Luddites, the original Luddites. That is, they were the beneficiaries of an earlier generation of technology, and now they will be the losers. And
it's never really the absolute state that you're in. It's comparative to where you once were, the status that other people have in society versus the status you have in society. It's all very
Fortune's
tricky.
wheel turns.
Yes, fortune's wheel turns. One of the things that I found really important about this book is that the history of textiles, from the first little strings to ridiculous innovations happening right now, has so many like incremental little things and then giant leaps forward and then incremental little things and giant leaps forward. I feel like there's like lots of lessons in there, both in terms of how humanity builds upon itself, like its capabilities and its knowledge, but also like what happens when that happens, because there's lots of stories in here about asymmetries in power, whether that's internal to a society. Obviously the slave trade was a big part of textiles. That's definitely the case in European society, but it's also the case in other societies. You've got like forced migration involved in this, but then also you've got like internal to society power structures when it comes to gender. And then these moments when big changes happen, it usually is accompanied by disruption, by upset, by riots, by like things that we've forgotten about.
And sometimes the results are not what people expect. So for example, Jacquard invented this attachment for looms that made it much easier to weave complex patterns. And a lot of people know that its relation to the history of computing.
Yeah.
And he was feted by the government and stuff for this great invention. But he was run out of Lyon, which was the weaving capital. But then eventually the weavers in Lyon adopted this attachment. They moved to a different part of the city. They became very powerful, they were the labor aristocrats, and they had a lot. I mean, they were kind of I don't want to be anachronistic, but sort of like the labor unions with a lot of clout and a lot of political influence. They were a seed of radicalism too, but it was because they had mastered that technology. It doesn't, first they think it's going to disadvantage them, then they adopt it and it becomes more powerful. I mean, that's obviously not what always happens.
And you can't see it. You can't know which way it's going to go. And you definitely can't see what's going to happen. I want to ask you if this project has given you what you feel like is maybe some unique insight into how innovation happens.
Well, I think that one of the insights that I've gotten from this is that every society and every culture across time and space has some really smart, innovative people in it, which then leads you to think about like, what are the conditions? This is beyond the scope of the book, but what are the conditions that leading to a takeoff, which is a big question in economic history. And my friend Joel Mokyr recently won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on this. But that it's not a lack of brain power, and it's not even a lack of the desire to innovate, because that seems to exist. Again, it may not be the dominant characteristic of everybody in the society, but there's enough of that, that leaven that you need to create really extraordinary things. And then the question is, when does that lead to sort of broader prosperity and continuing innovation, and when does it not? So that's one thing. And then another thing is, I just always feel like we underplay the importance of aesthetic innovation. That is innovation that may not change function, but changes the pleasure and meaning that people derive from stuff. And you even see that in software. What has happened with video gaming.
The aesthetics is such an interesting point, because I think that that's also a very easy thing to miss. It's very easy to think of everything as a technical innovation and not to think of it as how it actually integrates, not just with like human bodies, but with our minds and with our culture, and how culture is constantly evolving. And there's so many, like there's a lot of stories in the book about like times when people were like, no, we can't let this happen. We can't let these fabrics from other places into our markets. We can't let this new technology into our market. We have to protect, and it never works. That's the main thing is that you.
One of the examples, and I have a video about this on my YouTube channel, is what is the fabric prohibition. There's fabrics like this, which, and this is a dark one, but a lot of them were made light versions for the European markets, were very threatening to existing textile makers in Europe. When they came from India, even though there were Europeans who were importing them, there was the East India Company. And so there were all these protectionist measures adopted. And in France, they really went way out, and they not only prohibited imported cotton prints from India, they prohibited all cotton imports from India, even plain cloth, and all prints, even if they were made on French.
Right. So, because how could you tell if let's have none of this, because that way we know anytime we see it, it's illegal.
And they treated it, and this is not tariffs.
Yeah.
There were a lot of tariffs.
Yeah.
This was like cocaine.
Yeah.
They treated these fabrics the way we treat cocaine, and with similar scofflawing. Anyway,
similar flaunting of breaking the rules occasionally.
Flaunting, particularly among the powerful, of wearing of this.
And the sumptuary laws. I know that I love this so much, because I think a lot about like different ways to tax people that like they don't feel as bad about. This is, I think, an important conversation right now. People like the sort of salience of a tax, like property tax feels like a big thing because you pay it in one big lump sum. Sales tax feels a little less. VAT taxes, like they have in Europe, feel like you never really notice them at all, so you don't feel like you're paying them. But like my favorite tax of all time is saying to a person, no, you can't wear that unless you give us money. And then you're just sort of paying the government a tax that you want to pay so that you can wear a specific hem.
Yes. And so sumptuary laws, they're a kind of law that's popular in many different societies. And usually they're about establishing a class hierarchy.
Like if you're not in this class, you can't wear this clothing.
If you're not in this class, if you're a merchant in China, you cannot wear silk. If anybody in your family is a merchant, you cannot wear silk. It's very hierarchical. And so when I write about sumptuary laws, I contrast the way they work in different societies. And one of the weird things about sumptuary laws is there were all these sumptuary laws in these basically merchant-run city-states in Renaissance Italy. But these were the very people who are usually being kept down by sumptuary laws. They were trying to basically create a cartel. They were like a salary cap, if you will, against the demands of their women, of their wives and daughters.
They were saying like, oh, nope, we're not allowed to buy that expensive thing.
I mean, there were things with like in a dowry, if it was fabrics and clothes, the woman owned it. If it was money, cash, the husband got it, and people would use these to finance their businesses and stuff. But anyway, but it kept breaking down, partly because the women would find ways around it, but also because, people have various pressures, status things. And so first they started putting on fines. If we catch you with this, too many buttons or slashed sleeves, or, one of my favorites is too short of tunics on men. So if it was like wearing this thing that's like a mini skirt,
showing a little more thigh.
You have to pay to show your fine legs. That was a thing, men showing off.
I think we should do it more. I think there's not enough men showing off legs right now.
It was a big thing up until like the 19th century, basically.
We'll bring it back.
But over time, these fines became exactly what you were talking about. It becomes a fee, a tax. And they become very dependent on them to finance their military expenses and stuff. They need people to buy the fancy fabric,
and to have the short tunics for the men. It's like a war financed by men's short skirts.
Unfortunately, my picture of that didn't make it into the book, but you can find, if you comb through Renaissance art, you can find depictions of these very short tunics that
people are going to feel like they have learned so much from this conversation that there's no way that they could get a lot from the book, but there's so much more. There's so much we haven't talked about. Virginia, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time.
Pleasure. As you can tell, I love to talk about this stuff.
The book is The Fabric of Civilization, and you can get it where books are sold.